Yeah, all right. Well, thank you all for having me around. I guess most of you were here yesterday when I spoke yesterday afternoon about my vision for how we are likely to develop medicine against aging that really works sometime in the next few decades with a bit of luck. I thought that since Alan wanted me to give a second talk, the best thing for me to do would be to talk a little bit about the topic on which I actually spend more of my time than I spend on developing these medicines against aging, namely on persuading the rest of the world that such medicines would be a good idea. I know that by and large, everybody in this audience, certainly most people here right now, are already perfectly happily convinced that these medicines would be a good idea. However, I think it's useful, even insofar as I would be preaching to the choir, to give a little bit of an account of my experience and the sorts of arguments that I like to give and that I find to be effective in this area, so that sort of fills up you folks more effectively with the ability to go out and preach the gospel, so to speak, and perhaps do your part in altering public opinion. I think it is imperative that we do that. Firstly, because that will hasten the development of these therapies by increasing funding for them, and I can certainly tell you from my position at the coalface of getting these therapies implemented that shortage of funding is slowing things down very considerably at the moment. And secondly, because the more people think about these things properly and rationally, the less turbulent the transition into a post-aging world is going to be. The fact is, when these technologies come along, or even when they become widely anticipated, it's going to be quite exciting, so to speak. I think the Industrial Revolution will pale into insignificance in terms of the alterations in people's attitudes, people's priorities, people's ways of doing things. And if we are able, as a society, especially policymakers and opinion formers, to engage in some reasonably effective and well thought out forward planning before that point, then we will benefit greatly, in my view. So, here goes. First of all, I'm going to spend just a few minutes recapping some of the things I said yesterday, because I think we've got to put all of this in context, and also I guess maybe a few people here who didn't see my talk yesterday. First of all, I want to explain why I believe that this is humanity's biggest problem, and it simply comes down to numbers. The fact that 2/3 of all deaths worldwide are due to aging, and indeed 90% of all deaths in the industrialized world are due to aging. In other words, these causes that predominantly affect people who were born a long time ago. Whether this is a bad thing or not is really what I'm going to be talking about. And, I wish I could just stop here. I wish I could say, it just comes down to the fact that aging causes suffering. Because, it doesn't matter whether you have a specific disease of old age when you get older or whether you just gradually go downhill. The fact is, it's not a lot of fun. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be enough for most people. I talked yesterday, of course, a good deal about the nuts and bolts of how we expect, or how I expect to see the development of medicines that really work against aging, essentially the application of regenerative medicine, repair and maintenance technologies that periodically eliminate the accumulating damage of aging so that it never reaches the level of abundance that causes pathologies. And I talked also yesterday about the fact that even though these initial technologies that I think we have a respectable chance of developing within the next couple of decades will not be perfect, and will probably only give about 30 years of additional healthy life to those who receive them. Nevertheless, because those therapies will be applied to people who are already in middle age and will actually turn back the clock rather than just slowing it down, we have the rather useful feature that this buys enough time to improve the therapies and thereby rejuvenate people better the second time than the first time. And I introduced the topic of longevity escape velocity, the minimum rate at which we have to implement those improvements to the comprehensiveness of these technologies in order that we can stay one step ahead of the problem indefinitely and ensure that people do not suffer the diseases and disabilities and consequent likelihood of death associated with aging, however long they live. We talked about why this is realistic, that even if we make very, very, very pessimistic assumptions as to the rate at which we will improve that comprehensiveness, once we achieve that first breakthrough, the getting the first few decades of extra life, even if we're really pessimistic, we still get this concept of longevity escape velocity, where aging is avoided indefinitely. And I concluded by telling you what that meant in terms of longevity. The first person to live to 150 is, in my view, very probably already alive, might very well be as old as 50 or 60, because that person will simply benefit from the therapies that are able to add 30 years to extra life. And I think those therapies have a respectable chance of coming along within the next 25 years. However, once that has occurred, we will have done the hard part, and therefore people who can live indefinitely, and 40-year lifespans are perfectly realistic in that circumstance, is probably only slightly younger. So that was the conclusion of yesterday. So now, let's move on to the topics today. The reactions that I received from the general public, and from policymakers and opinion formers and so on, and even from biologists, when I talk about this, tend to be of the nature that I described here. People say, well, I wouldn't spend all this time being old and frail and miserable. And they'll say they wouldn't want to live a long time even if they were healthy. And they'll raise various sociological objections, like the possibility of overpopulation, or inequality of access to these technologies, or dictators living forever, or difficulty paying the pensions, or whatever. And finally, they'll say things that essentially exhibit selfishness. They'll essentially say, well, it won't be time for me, so I don't really care very much. And I'm going to address each of these things briefly. I'm going to start with this one. You know, it's pretty extraordinary that people will react to a story that talks about the elimination of age-related ill health in this way. It's as if they just weren't listening, right? I mean, it's not as if I'm the first person to come along and say the message that I have here, right? That it's all about health, and that any longevity benefits that might result are a side benefit. That's what gerontologists have been saying since the dawn of gerontology, you know, since World War II. It's completely extraordinary that people continue not to get that message and to make what sociologists have started to call the Tithonus error, which is named after a Greek myth, actually. My view is that the only way that this can possibly be explained is that people are willfully letting this what scientists are saying on this matter go in one ear and out the other. And I'll come back to why they would be so desperate to do that and not to get this message later on in the talk. People will say this, they really will say, well, okay, even if I stay healthy, even if I accept this supposed story that we're going to be able to postpone age-related ill health indefinitely, and that's why we're going to get this longevity, it doesn't sound like much fun living such a long time. Well, people will really say this. But, you know, we've got to get pretty good at pointing out, in perhaps a gentle but nevertheless firm manner, how ridiculous such an attitude actually is. Yesterday I made fun of it in a somewhat more flippant manner. I said that having an opinion about how long you want to live is like having an opinion about what time you want to go to the toilet a week from now. It's something on which it's ridiculous to have an opinion because you know you're going to have better information on the topic nearer the time. It's just the same. But another, perhaps slightly less pugnacious way of saying the same thing is what I've written up here. If we go back, and this is really the message here, it's always worth going back again and again and again to the fact that this is all about keeping people healthy and that longevity is a side effect. If we go back to that, then we can ask these questions. We can say, well, okay, do you actually want to get sick anytime soon? And people will generally be fairly happy to agree that they do not want to get sick anytime soon. But then you can say, well, hang on, do you foresee any time in the future when you will want to get sick soon? You know, I mean that, you know. And once you can understand, and then people will sort of understand that, it's rather like being a different person. I believe that tomato ketchup is the work of the devil, and I very much expect that I always will hate tomato ketchup, right? I would be a different person if I wanted to get sick sometime soon. And so people will generally accept this. And then we say, okay, suppose you don't want to get sick, would you like to die sometime soon, even though you're not sick? Would you like to get hit by a truck sometime soon? People will generally accept that they don't want that to happen either. And then, of course, you can ask the same question again. You can say, do you foresee a time when you will want to get hit by a truck? And, you get it, right? That's all you need to make the argument. Because then you can say, well, okay, so in order to minimise the risk that you will in fact get sick sometime soon, eventually, or something like that, what's the best thing to do? Clearly the best thing to do is to do your bit to hasten the development of therapies that will stop you from ever getting sick. It just stands to reason. And people, people will squirm at this, but the fact is, and they will try to change the subject here. You never let anyone change the subject. They will start to try extremely hard to do so when they see that they're up against someone who's actually thought about it. Now, I'm going to spend a little more time on the sociological objections, because these are the ones that I have to spend most time on when I talk to journalists or when I talk to the general public in the Q&A after scientific talks and so on. And, it's fair enough that people would look at the prospect of a post-aging world and immediately start to think about what might be the catch. What might be the downsides of this ostensibly good thing, namely the elimination of all the suffering associated with aging. The business of the risk of overpopulation is the one that comes up first, that's for sure. It comes up most often. But again, we can come back to the question of longevity being a side benefit of health. So, here's the way I put it. Which one of these things do you favour? If you don't favour defeating aging, actually bringing aging under complete medical control so that nobody ever gets sick however long they live, then you've basically got to take one of the other two positions I put up here. Either you've got to say that it would be good, the some age at which it's good for people to get sick, okay, or you've got to say there's some age at which it's good for people to die even if they're not yet sick. That's what you've got to say. There's just no logical way out of that. So do you want a world in which medicine just doesn't work very well? Or do you want a world like Logan's Run, where we kill people at a particular age even though they don't really want to die? This is really the options. And people will, of course, try and wriggle out of this in various ways. People will say, people will immediately dive into the question of feasibility. They'll say, I don't really want to talk about this because after all, it's just academic, isn't it? We're never going to be able to bring medicine under medical control, so who cares whether we actually have, a logical, ethical position on the matter? And this is actually a really important thing to grab by the jugular as soon as it happens. People will do this. They will implicitly take a position of, listen, I refuse to think seriously and talk seriously about the question of whether it would be a good idea to defeat aging, because it's obviously never going to happen. And at the same time, the same people will equally strongly take the implicit position that, I don't really think it's worth talking seriously about whether there is any prospect of defeating aging with medicine, because it's obviously a bad idea. In other words, it's all just a circular, mutual catch-22. So it's worth spending quite a lot of time embarrassing people into actually separating these questions in their minds so that one can address them individually without this mutual, obfuscation that happens otherwise. Another thing is, finessing the concept of being sick. People are terribly fond of the idea of being healthy for one's age, whatever the hell that means. Sure, there are some 90-year-olds who are much better off health-wise than others. There are some 90-year-olds that don't have the diseases of old age, the ones that we bother to give names to, like Alzheimer's or various cancers or cardiovascular disease or whatever. And, you know, they are probably a good deal more able-bodied than your average 90-year-old. And it's reasonable for medicine to aspire to a world in which people don't get as sick as the average 90-year-old is today, and instead they only get as sick as 90-year-olds like that. But that's still sick, just because we haven't given names to the problems that these people have got. The fact is that their function has diminished. They can no longer keep up with their granddaughters on the dance floor. This is just how it is, and it's not much fun being like that. So we cannot let people get away with finessing the definition of what it is to be sick. The fact is, loss of function is loss of function. So once we've got through those two wriggles, we can go on. What did I do here? I can't remember. Oh yeah, that's right. Hang on for a second. There's, you know, taking the thing by the scruff of the neck and saying, well, okay, maybe I was wrong about medicine. People will actually say, well, okay, yes, historically we have viewed medicine as an unalloyed, definite good thing. Okay. But maybe it's not true. Maybe there are certain circumstances in which medicine would have social consequences that would be so apocalyptic that the benefits of medicine would not be so good. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I've put up here for completeness the Logan's Run scenario, maybe saying, well, okay, maybe it's sometimes good for people actually to die even when they're healthy. But, you know, I'm not going to take that one really very seriously, simply because even the most die-hard opponent of medicine against aging tends not to say that. So I've just put that one in for completeness, but I won't address it any further today. I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more. The idea of something being impossible, but who cares? And you don't have to read all this, of course, but I've just put some quotes up here from really rather acrimonious exchange of views that took place several years ago now in the academic literature between me and a bunch of my more vocal critics within gerontology, many of whom I'm pleased to say have now very much come around to the appreciation that the thing I've been saying for the past decade is actually perfectly reasonable. But yes, there was a great deal of opposition and, well, I would go so far as to say ridicule of the ideas I was putting forward back then. And I had to work quite hard to educate my critics and indeed neutral experts on the matter. The question has to be, you know, why did I have to work so hard? What can be so, you know, so threatening about a new idea in science or in technology? It seems like, you know, that's obviously always a good thing to have new suggestions for ways to improve quality of life for humanity. Ultimately, it comes down to this. It comes down to the fact that, first of all, scientists tend not to know very much about areas outside their own expertise. Science is massively organised these days, simply because it has to be. There's not enough money to pay all the scientists to go around, and therefore people have to really focus on getting money from wherever they can for the things that they're already good at, rather than trying to embrace new areas of expertise. It's also worth bearing in mind that science is not some, you know, saintly discipline unlike any other in which vested interests are mysteriously absent. Scientists very much have vested interests too, and especially they have a vested interest in maintaining people's view of their omniscience, their the idea that they actually know everything about anything that could possibly be relevant to their area, which they certainly don't. One thing that's also worth bearing in mind is that every scientist knows perfectly well that when you want to express a criticism of a scientific idea, you have to actually stick to expressing criticism of the idea, rather than criticism of the person who is propounding the idea. If you do the latter, that's called an ad hominem argument, and it's well known to be inadmissible, and you'll certainly see non-scientists using ad hominem arguments all the time, but when you see scientists doing it, you can be damn sure that there's something fishy going on, because scientists know that they shouldn't be doing it. So it's a sort of it's an explicit capitulation. It shows that they have nothing better. The big thing I want to say, however, the reason I've spent a few minutes on this, is that there's an enormous amount of damage done by this sort of thing. And I want to include here not only professional scientists, but also people who try to help educate the public, try to make it their business to help the public to evaluate science properly. People who tend to call themselves skeptics, for example. People like Sam Harris or Daniel Dennis and so on, people like that. Some people are better than others at actually making sure that they're right before they start speaking out on these matters. And some people are less careful, to be perfectly honest. It can do an enormous amount of harm to ridicule and marginalise a good idea, because it can, of course, slow down the implementation of that idea, and thereby slow down the contribution to the human condition that the implementation might actually achieve. And I'm afraid that the defeat of ageing and the feasibility of defeating ageing has been a rather severe victim of that process, so that problem may be diminishing at this point. I'm going to talk now about this business about, I'm actually not going to talk very much about this. The fact is, this whole business about being healthy for your age, this person here, it doesn't matter really whether they've got something that's been diagnosed, does it? The fact is, I doubt that there's anyone in this room who would not in fact prefer to be this person on the left, even if he is about to have his head bitten off by a shark. So it's pretty straightforward. Finally, this business about medicine, actually not necessarily being universally a good thing. I want to give a couple of, talk about a couple of points addressing that, because this argument collapses in a number of interesting ways. First of all, let's talk about the precautionary principle. This is a rather popular idea that says essentially what I'm saying here, that we should be very cautious about developing technology that might be bad for us. We've heard today a little bit about AGI and the possibility of creating what a lot of people call unfriendly artificial intelligence, machines that become vastly more capable and powerful than humans, and that may or may not actually be autonomous enough to go about fulfilling their goals, which we may have initially defined, but which may be evolving as the intelligence of the machines evolves. Bad things can happen, as you've heard today. So this may very well, some people think it is an argument for simply going slow on the development of AGI. However, I think it is pretty difficult to use that argument as a way of opposing the development of therapies against aging, because an argument about the dangers of AGI is rather like an argument against the dangers of developing nuclear technology, which I think a lot of people would say we wish we hadn't, in that these technologies can allow small numbers of people to do, or small numbers of entities anyway, to do large amounts of harm, very large maybe, in a very short amount of time. Therapy against aging can't do that. They can only change the world very gradually. And that's a really, really big difference. I think we've also got to understand that the idea of technology being misused is equivalent. Right? The distinction I'm making there between the first and second items up there is, technology like AGI might destroy us without even being misused on purpose. It might just be, we might just have what people call a hard takeoff, where machines just get out of control on their own. The misuse example there, I just explicitly mean a case where humans are actually achieving the goals that those particular humans want to achieve, but they are not in the interest of the rest of us. However, we also need to look at the risks of not developing technology. A few years ago, Max Moore came out with the phrase the proactionary principle, which he used as a way of contrasting the risks of developing technologies with the risks of not developing technologies. But ultimately, I would say that you could actually cast the proactionary principle as an example of the precautionary principle, that one should not suppress or be scared of the development of technology that can do good. And I want to elaborate on what I mean there, because ultimately what I mean there is all about the conclusions that we can come to on the basis of what we don't know. Normally we think, well, okay, if we're uncertain about some particular aspect of the future, then we should be more cautious about changing the future. But that's not really the right way to think about it. The way we should think about it is, if it's something we don't know about the future, let's look at what the worst case scenario would be in either case, neutrally, in the case where we've developed the technology and in the case where we haven't. Now, here are just a few things we don't know about the distant future. We don't know how many kids people are going to want to have on average. We don't know at what age they're going to want to have them. We don't know how other technologies, like nuclear fusion, for example, will alter the extent to which the average human being has a carbon footprint or other environmental impact, and therefore alter the carrying capacity of the planet. All of those things, of course, have an enormous impact on the severity of the question of overpopulation. They alter either the trajectory of how many people there will be on the planet in any given year, or they alter the impact on the environment of a given number of people. And I've given one more thing at the bottom there, which I've mentioned because it doesn't necessarily apply, it doesn't necessarily have relevance to overpopulation, but it has relevance to other questions that come up when people are looking at the sociological impact of defeating aging. People say, well, how will we pay the pensions, or how will we make sure that people get paid equitably and people just don't stay in the same job for 500 years and this, that and the other. The fact is we don't know whether people are going to have jobs at all in the way that we know them today. We don't know whether automation of the sort that, again, we've heard about in other talks earlier today, will progress to the point where we no longer actually have these problems, because the prerequisites for the problems, the idea of having to work to actually feed yourself and so on, has gone away. So, when I say that we don't know all these things, why is that so important? The answer is that if we did not develop a given technology, in this case, technology to defeat aging, because we thought that we did know about the future, or we thought we knew what the future was likely to be like, and we were wrong, then humanity in the future is not going to be very happy with us. Humanity in the future is going to find themselves condemned to an unnecessarily early and unnecessarily painful death, because they don't have technologies that they could have had if we'd taken the trouble to develop them as quickly as we could. And they're not going to like that very much. They're not going to be very impressed that we thought that we were so clever to think that they would be worse off if they had these technologies, and therefore we would do them a favour by not developing them. That, to me, is a far worse scenario than a scenario in which we develop technologies and we rely on humanity in the future to be reasonably smart about how and whether to actually use them. So to my mind, a fine explicit example here of the precautionary principle is to guard against the risk that we will condemn a whole cohort of humanity to an unnecessarily painful death. Another argument that I like to use that gets to the bottom of all of this, and this is again really a way of addressing all of the various sociological arguments against defeating aging all in one go, and as such somewhat more powerful than arguments that try to actually analyse each individual concern about the distant future individually. I just say, well, okay, let's look at some other scenarios, some hypothetical scenarios. Maybe they're realistic, maybe they're not, but the point is they have certain similarities to the scenario that we're talking about, and let's ask ourselves what we would do in those situations. So I've got a couple up here that I've discussed in print over the years. The first one is, let's suppose, and I know that this is medically unrealistic, but I'm going to say that's not the point here. Let's suppose that suddenly the HIV virus evolved so that it can be transmitted in the way that the common cold is transmitted. It can be transmitted just without sexual contact or blood transfusions or anything like that. We'd be in a bit of a pickle, really, because the thing is, I mean, it's hard to know whether someone's got HIV. They don't actually exhibit any symptoms for quite a long time. So you can't really react by, for example, quarantining people in the way that one can do with bird flu or whatever. Bit of a problem there. So basically, if this were to happen, we would end up with pretty much everyone on the planet having HIV awfully quickly. That sounds bad. But what would we actually do have drugs that can, at the moment, indefinitely postpone the progression of HIV to full-blown AIDS. They're damn expensive. And of course, this argument, since the time that I first put it forward, several years ago in print, has become somewhat borne out by the progressive alteration of policy of the major drug companies with regard to making HIV drugs available at cost or less in sub-Saharan Africa. We would work damn hard to make sure that people did not get full-blown AIDS. Furthermore, of course, we put a great deal more effort into into finding actual cures for HIV, so that people could stop taking these drugs that merely stop them merely hold HIV in treading water, so to speak. So in other words, we would actually react in a manner that had that demonstrated and that implemented universal access to these therapies. Ultimately, it's all about universal access being an easy thing to justify to people who are among the people who are suffering. Perhaps the only reason why it was difficult to get the equitable distribution of anti-HIV drugs in sub-Saharan Africa in the first place was that most drug company CEOs don't have AIDS, and most heads of state don't have AIDS and so on. So, we can analyse these scenarios, that scenario in whatever way we like, in whatever degree of detail we like, and we can make the analogy with the scenario of having therapies against aging. And we can ask, would we really actually choose not to make these therapies available? That's what leads me to the other scenario I'm mentioning on this slide, the idea of drugs that defeat aging actually materialising suddenly when we weren't expecting them to. That's a scenario which, again, I think is unrealistic, but which we can nevertheless compare with past scenarios. For example, the discovery that you could vaccinate against certain diseases that Jenner discovered when he realised that milkmaids didn't tend to get smallpox. The discovery that hygiene is good for you, which of course was Pasteur's discovery, or before him, against Semmelweis. We didn't say, oh dear, if we let people know all of these things and we disseminate this information, then there will be a terrible population spike because all of those kids that are dying in infancy at the moment will survive and have their own kids and so on. So let's make sure we don't tell anyone about this until we have established that everyone's going to use contraception. We didn't do that. And I don't think anyone thinks we should have done that. So again, we can ask, if these therapies existed, then would we use them? Of course we'd damn well use them. It's really obvious. So that means that in order to argue against the development of these therapies, we have to say that somehow it's bad to hasten the development of something that would be good if we already have it. And that just makes no sense whatsoever. So this is quite an interesting argument, an effective argument to use against these things. Finally, this one. I want to actually spend a little time on this because this really brings me to my conclusion. I'm going to stop in only a few minutes so as to give plenty of time for a little discussion about all this. I know that lots of you in the audience will have opinions on all of this, and so I decided to restrict my remarks to no more than about half an hour and leave lots of time for discussion. This is a really interesting one. This genuinely happens. People will say, well, I'm not really interested in this, I'll die before these things are going to be developed. And of course, I talk to a lot of people who've got money because I'm trying to get them to give it to me, and a lot of people who have money are getting on. And they're probably right that this therapy isn't going to be in time for them. But hang on, well, when I get that sort of reaction from an audience, an elderly audience especially, I'll say, all right now, hands up everyone in the audience who's got kids, and most people will put their hands up. And I'll say, okay, put your hands down now. Hands up anyone in the audience who's got kids and doesn't give a damn about their welfare. I mean, but unfortunately that's genuinely the situation. I know of examples where people have said this in front of their kids. So, I mean, last I heard, altruism was generally quite fashionable. The idea of actually thinking about other people, especially people that you're supposed to care about, it's pretty weird. So, what's going on? What's the deal here? This is the deal. This is my psychology slide, and many of you will have seen this before because I've been putting this forward for many years. The fact is, the reason why people are so totally crazy when it comes to the question of the concept of defeating aging is because it used to be a very good idea to be crazy about this. It used to be very sensible, very rational, to engage in whatever level of psychological self-manipulation you needed to in order to trick yourself into putting aging out of your mind. Aging, let's face it, it's very ghastly indeed, and while it's completely inevitable, and while furthermore, in the case of most of you, it's not going to happen to you for quite a long time, not going to affect your health for quite a long time, that's a pretty daunting thing to spend your life being preoccupied by. So it makes sense to find some way not to be preoccupied by it, to put it out of your mind. And it doesn't matter how irrational your rationalizations actually are, so long as they work. That's what it's all about. It is rational to put ghastly but inevitable things out of your mind. I mentioned science fiction down here. Science fiction about, quote, immortality, whatever that is one of my biggest problems in my advocacy efforts. Because the fact is, science fiction about immortality sells papers, it sells books, it sells units, people go and see films about it all the time. But why do they go? They go because they come away feeling comforted, feeling good about the thing. And what do they feel good about? They feel good about the fact that the storyline always has some feature of it that makes the defeat of aging a bad idea. The story will begin with a completely uncritical assertion that there's going to be a desperate overpopulation problem, for example. And everything else will be built on that, and by the time you've got to the end of the film, you've totally forgotten that that assertion was completely never justified. It's just that the world was horrible as a result. Now, the more that sort of thing happens, the more stories are written that encourage people to engage in, suspension of disbelief, which is of course what science fiction is all about. And people actually succeed in engaging in that suspension of disbelief, the more difficult it gets for those of us who want to actually get people to grow up and be rational about this, to make that happen. The more difficult it gets, because the more entrenched the pro-aging trance, as I have called it, eventually gets to be. So, of course, the whole thing only falls apart once this inevitability has become unclear, but as I explained yesterday, it certainly has become unclear. We are within striking distance of combating aging, and this pro-aging trance is now an immense part of the problem. All right, so I'll stop there, and I'll invite anyone who has an opinion on all of this to tell us about it.
Hi, Aubrey. Thank you very, very much for your talk. You made it very clear that you shouldn't let people wiggle out of answering questions. Where do we put all the people?
Well, as I say, we don't know whether we're going to have an overpopulation problem. So, people are only going to get older of 1 year per year, whatever happens. We're not going to have any 1,000-year-old people for another 900 years, whatever happens. Other technologies happen really quickly. Other sociological changes, not necessarily driven by technologies, also happen really quickly by comparison with that. So this is why I put up those three just totem examples of the things we don't know about the even relatively near-term future, like 50 years from now, let alone the distant future. Now, as you can see, those things profoundly affect the extent to which any defeat of aging would actually result in any kind of overpopulation issue. So, this is what I'm saying. Maybe society in the future will find that it needs to impose some kind of restriction so that people have fewer kids than they would otherwise want to. Maybe it won't. But it's up to us to give humanity in the future the choice, because maybe we won't have the problem at all, and if they do have the problem, maybe they prefer to have the problem and solve it rather than have have the problem that we have today. Simple as that.
Hi, thanks for your talks, it's been really great. I was just wondering if you could give some cases of like the dumbest arguments you've heard against your project, or the funniest things that people have said, or anything like that.
It's been a very, very long time since I've heard a question or a concern that I haven't heard before, so nothing's dumb or funny anymore, it's just cheap. I'm just jaded, really.
Say we were to live 5 times longer, would we be able to delay having our kids until 5 times later, in which case at least the birth rate might be something like what we have now?
Yes, we certainly would. The menopause is a process that is intrinsically linked to aging, as you know. It's caused by the depletion and eventually exhaustion of the supply of egg cells in the ovary. The ovary is just another organ, and it can be replaced just like any other organ, or it can be rejuvenated in situ like any other organ. In principle, we can't really do this yet, but actually we're not all that far away from being able to do it. So if you imagine the current situation where we see a gradual increase in the world record age of motherhood, the only reason why it's a gradual increase is because these people are getting old in other ways. Once we've got comprehensive postponement of all age-related ill health, then maintenance of the ability to have children at any age will just be a natural consequence of that.
Oh, hi. I just was struck by your comment about lack of funding. I must be very ignorant here, but I can't understand why all the younger, very wealthy people in the world are inundating you with resources.
Yeah. So, of course, the SENS Foundation does actually get most of its funding from people exactly like that, wealthy individuals of my sort of age, people in their 40s and 50s rather than people who are considerably older. However, as you said, it's surprising that even only a small minority of such people are actually willing to chip in. And something that gives a little bit of insight into that is the fact that a number of even quite well-known billionaires of that sort of generation have expressed very clear and unequivocal verbal support for this mission, and yet still they don't put significant money in. Seems very curious, doesn't it? The only real explanation that I have for that is that these people have other concerns in the back of their minds that are among the irrationalities I described here, that hold them back. Now, in many cases, they may not actually hold any of these concerns themselves, but there may be people that, for whatever reason, they respect or they don't want to piss off, that do hold those concerns, and for whatever reason, the billionaire in question is not very good at expressing arguments to persuade such people of the invalidity of those things. You know, billionaires' wives are a terrible problem. There's no billionaires in the audience, let alone any.
Is it possible that it's because the billionaires are a problem, the wives are a problem?
Well, as I say, I'm talking about the particular ones who, at least verbally, express strong support for all of this and strong appreciation of the stupidity of all the arguments I've been describing today.
Thanks, Aubrey. We have a lot of citizen journals these days, thanks to the internet. What role, if any, could you see citizen scientists playing in the future, and can we crowdsource intelligence?
I think that the main way in which we are going to shift public opinion, whether it's among opinion formers, the media and so on, or whether it's among scientists in general, and thereby get this work done faster, is just by repeat advertising. Essentially by step-by-step, making it less and less scary to become in favour of this mission, and eventually making it more and more scary not to be. But it's a very just slow, steady process. I think, yes, that scientists in general and journalists in general, whether they're on the net or anywhere, can all do their bit. It's just really, it all adds up. Eventually, as more and more people in perhaps minor roles, whether in the media or in the scientific world, come on board, it becomes easier and easier for people in more major and more influential roles to come on board as well, and so on. Eventually it becomes impossible to get re-elected unless you're in favour of all of it.
Thank you for your talk. I've worked in pharmaceutical science and biotechnology for 40 years, and there are hundreds of thousands of biomedical researchers all over the world trying to either slow down, prevent or cure things that knock us off like cancer, or things that spoil our enjoyment of life like Alzheimer's, etc. And I don't have a problem with seeing a continuing extension of a kind of Moore's law where every decade we extend life expectancy by another 2.5 years, whatever the logarithmic rate of progress is. But I think it's a very large leap between that and saying we can reach this escape velocity idea of living, for 1,000 years or forever. Mm-hmm. And for example, my perspective on it is that we're teeming with cells which are dying and being regenerated at a colossal rate. Mm-hmm. For example, we generate 1 million new blood cells every second. Mm-hmm. And life is basically a balance between programmed cell death or apoptosis and uncontrolled growth, which is cancer. And we really are a homeostatic mechanism for a balance between everything dying too rapidly or everything getting out of control with growth and turning into cancer. There's a Melbourne-based scientist, she's no longer in Melbourne, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009, Margaret Blackburn, for
Elizabeth
Blackburn for her work on telomeres. And as you're aware, one of the basic problems of the idea of a very long lifespan is that you lose a little bit. You lose a little bit every time the cell divides. So my question really is, what evidence have you got that we're going to be able to, what scientific evidence is there that we can leap beyond knocking off things that kill us to actually preventing aging?
Right, so 3 answers. First is, I guess you probably didn't see my talk yesterday. I went into the science of all of this in some detail, but of course even an hour is not nearly enough because one cannot realistically come to any degree of confidence in the plausibility of all of this without going into a great deal of detail. So the right place to go, if you don't have time to talk to me afterwards, is my book that I wrote about 5 years ago. It's called Ending Aging, and it goes into all these details. Of course, I've also published all the technical details of all this in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, so I can send you some reprints and so on if you want. So without going into all the science again, one thing I do want to comment on is the wording you use at the end of your remarks just then. I think it's extremely important to understand that science and technology are different. And the way that a scientist thinks of the word evidence and the value of evidence and the way that one goes about evaluating the importance of a particular item of evidence is completely different from how a technologist does it. Because what a scientist is trying to do is to figure out how nature is, and what a technologist is trying to do is to alter the way that nature is. Now, medicine is a branch of technology, not a branch of science. So, if you ask what evidence I have for the possibility that the proposals I've been describing for the last decade or so will actually develop into something that will essentially indefinitely postpone age-related ill health, then it all comes down to breaking down the problem into various sub-problems, asking, okay, how will we solve this sub-problem, what evidence is that this particular approach to solving it would actually solve it, and then, of course, putting the whole thing together and saying, what is the evidence that this set of sub-problems is a sufficient set, it's an exhaustive set. Yes, and all that is there, don't worry, all that is there, that's for sure. Final thing I want to say about all of this, I forgot, it was important as well. No, it wasn't. I already said read the book.
Mitosis?
No, it wasn't a technical thing. Oh yes, that's right. So a lot of people, a lot of scientists and a lot of technologists actually take the view that it can't be possibly true that this approach to combating aging would have this dramatic, potentially indefinite effect on postponing age-related ill health. Because, we're trying awfully hard with medicine, and medicine keeps making progress, and yet we only see this very, very slow increase in the average longevity. Okay. And that's an interesting argument, but it really isn't a very good one, because what it relies upon is the assumption that the introduction of future technologies will work in the same way. You can think of it by analogy with crossing the Atlantic. If you'd asked people in 1900 how long it would take to cross the Atlantic in 1930, they would have answered the question by extrapolating from the rate of progress and the speed of ocean-going liners. And of course, there was new technology that came along, a different way of going about the problem, which made that answer look pretty stupid. And it's exactly the same here. In this case, the approach to combating aging that we're looking at is regenerative medicine. Actually repairing the accumulating molecular cellular damage that goes on throughout life and is eventually bad for us, rather than slowing down the creation of that damage, which is essentially the approach that has traditionally been pursued by gerontologists. This turns out to be a very radical departure. It's rather counterintuitive, in fact I would say it's very counterintuitive to think that an approach that actually turns back the clock would be easier to implement than an approach that slows down the clock. But it turns out, once you look at the details, that is the case. And that is why it doesn't work to extrapolate from the slow rate of progress that we've seen over the past 50 years or whatever to a continued slow rate of progress. I actually think that over the next 20 years or so, we're likely to see the rate of increase of longevity in the developed world slowing down, plateauing, relative to the rate that we've seen since World War II. And only 20 or 30 years from now, when these regenerative therapies come along and start to really work, will we see a resumption in that increase. But when we do see that resumption, it will not be a resumption at the rate we see today, it will be a very, very rapid one.
Hello, thank you. My question is about what you emphasise in your lobbying and education. I think you said that longevity is a byproduct of improved gerontology and therapy.
Improved health, yeah.
Yeah, improved health. Is that what you emphasise? I just wonder whether when this notion of 1,000 years idea scares people and that people think the idea of pushing a walking frame around for 920 years it's not a great idea, and that it's actually more important to emphasise even the short, medium-term benefits of improved health now. I wonder whether this 1,000-year idea is an obstacle to you.
Yeah, this is a big dilemma that I've had since the beginning of my work in this area, and certainly since the beginning of when I started to come to the attention of the media. It's critical to ensure that people get the message that this is all about health and that the longevity benefits are a side benefit. But it's also critical to make sure that they get the message that this is not just medicine as usual. That if we only talk about specific age-related diseases and the possibility of preempting them using such methods, then people are going to think, yeah, well, this is just one more way of attacking these specific diseases. They're going to be underwhelmed. I won't get into the papers in the first place. I won't come to the attention of people who might actually be able to do something about this. So initially, in fact, the first few years of my reasonably high-profile media exposure and conference exposure, I basically just had to let people say what they wanted to say, even if it was sensationalistically focused on the extreme longevity claims that I was making. I couldn't stop people using the word immortality in the titles of our articles, and I didn't really try. Over the past few years, since I've become more of a sort of media fixture, I've been able to take a much more aggressive line. And if you go through a sort of timeline of the videos on YouTube, for example, of me, you will see a progressive shift in how aggressive I am, how assertive I am in shutting people up and shutting people down when they try to focus on longevity for the sake of longevity as if that were what I was about. So it's easier now. it's got a lot easier now. And for all of you, you know, if you talk about this and people talk to you and say, well, I wouldn't want to live forever or all that, you will now be able not only to say what I say, but also be able to say that I say what I say. You know, and make sure, and be clear that this is not just you deviating from my party line or anything.
Aubrey, given longevity escape velocity, would you also subscribe to a body escape velocity as well? In other words, instead of focusing on the health of the body with increasing age, we think about examining and interrogating the evolutionary architecture of the body. We don't accept the evolutionary sort of status quo, and we examine possibilities of redesigning the body altogether. I'm not talking about disembodied intelligence, but rather alternate embodiments that will kind of function and experience and operate more effectively in the world.
Yeah, okay, this is a very important area, and it's an area that I don't get asked about nearly enough, so thank you. I think that the whole question of the distinction between what's a therapy and what's an enhancement is one that really finds its most, the rubber hits the road in that question more sharply in relation to this sort of work than pretty much anywhere else in future technology. And it's something that I think, you know, it obviously does come up in conferences like this quite often, especially ones that are more philosophically oriented. Personally, I think that it's, first of all, pretty much inevitable that these technologies, as we develop them, will give rise to similar technologies, consequent technologies that are going to be used in different ways, that would be unequivocally enhancements. In terms of whether that's a good thing, sure. I mean, I don't think there's anything really problematic about the concept of enhancements. People, of course, are terribly focused very often on the distinction between an enhancement that is inside the body and one that's outside. So, for example, people are quite surprised when one points out that spectacles are an enhancement. And they don't really think of them that way. They're perfectly happy with spectacles. But when they think about something like a cochlear implant, you know, they don't quite think about it that way. And cochlear implants don't really, you know, become much of a topic of conversation in terms of their merits at the moment, because they're used to take people who are profoundly deaf and give them some hearing. But as little as 5 years from now, I'm told, it's quite possible that we will have cochlear implants that give people better than normal hearing. And at that point, of course, they will become an enhancement. And you may get, you know, people who, musicians, for example, actually having cochlear implants electively. In terms of more dramatic enhancements, you know, people have been working for some time on redesigning the dorsal musculature so that people could actually have wings. And of course, that's a very long way away, but nevertheless, I can't really persuade myself that it's theoretically impossible. People would quite like to have gills so that they could swim underwater a long time. Personally, you know, I don't like wearing clothes, and therefore I think it's a bit of a shame that people have such poor thermoregulation, so that there's only a narrow range of temperatures within which they can be comfortable. And you know, I'm sure that's something we can fix. You know, so yeah, absolutely. I'm generally in favour of all the obvious sorts of enhancements.
Going back to one of the objections that you face, I wouldn't want to live forever. I feel like I haven't heard you address this in any of your presentations that I've seen. The question, which is foreign to pretty much everyone here, but the idea that people might at some point in the future genuinely no longer wish to live, even if they're healthy. And I'm just a bit puzzled as to why you haven't addressed this, because to me it's a really quite simple answer, which is that the obvious solution to that is suicide decided then when you want it and not worried about now.
Okay, so I've sort of addressed that indirectly, and perhaps too indirectly, so let me elaborate a little. The first thing is, yes, clearly one answer to the objection, well, I wouldn't want to live forever, is, you know, well volunteered, be my guest. But I think that's too glib, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the fact is today, when people are suicidal, we try to change their minds. And we don't decide whether or not to try to change their minds on the basis of how long ago they were born. As far as we're concerned, it's only how healthy people are that in any way impacts our view of the merits of suicide, or euthanasia for that matter. So if they're healthy, then we definitely try to change their minds. So, you know, a retort to that good answer, well volunteered, is, well, hang on, you know, maybe you won't let me refuse the therapies. Because we may well not really, you know, we may quite strongly coerce people into having the therapies because we think it's going to be good for them and they're going to, you know, be able to see the light and get the most out of what life has to offer. Also, the big thing is that I try to emphasise in my remarks today is it's all about not knowing what's going to happen. Forward planning is about working today to hedge your bets for what you don't know about the future. So people may say, well, I may want to die. I may actually want to die sometime in the distant future, even if I'm still healthy. Now, we could say, well, volunteer, but we could also say, yeah, but maybe you won't want to. So how are we going to make sure that we can hedge your bets so that you don't have to die if you don't want to? That's all, really. It's all about focusing on the value of uncertainty and what we can infer from that uncertainty.
Hello, Aubrey. Let's move to a place where exponential invention happens, where we've got all of these technologies coming together, the medical systems to keep us healthy are there. What do you anticipate, and this is looking to the future, as being the ethical and the policy-bound restrictions that stop people from being able to access that? How can we work towards mitigating the risk that someone will just say, well, no, we're just not going to go there?
I'm not entirely sure I heard the question. Are you talking about the risk of only some people being able to actually benefit from these therapies?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about we're very close to breakthroughs in all areas. It's all looking good. And then policymakers and public opinion ethics converge in a negative manner to try to prevent the enhancement being done. And how do we work towards what do you foresee as being at that point? I mean, yes, it's one of those things you can't foresee, but you can somewhat see that there would be ethical and policy-bound naysayers.
So the concern that you're talking about then is that when these therapies become widely anticipated, there will be a public policy, a public opinion, backlash maybe, where people are saying, well, okay, we still don't want these therapies, even though we may have them very soon. Yeah, that's right. I don't think that's a realistic scenario. Basically, my view is that once the progress that we're making in the laboratory, in mice, has reached a sufficiently impressive state such that it becomes clear to specialists worldwide, to specialists in general, not just me, that it's only a matter of time before these therapies become available to humans, then game over. You know, people are just going to abandon this pro-aging chance completely and start being rational about all of this. The only reason that people are clinging to the view that aging is bad, it's good for you, and that not having aging is bad, is because they can't yet bring themselves to believe that it's going to be in time for them, and you know, therefore they're trying to put it out of their minds and hedge their bets, psychologically, so to speak. Now, of course, on the one hand, that's good. It means that we don't have to worry about, I would say anyway, the possibility of any kind of resistance from anybody at that point. And therefore the focus has to be now on hastening the speed at which we reach that threshold of credibility for this work, before which we do have this pro-aging chance problem. But also, of course, there's the difficulty that once we do hit that, it's going to be a very, very sharp tipping point. That's when there's going to be the real pandemonium, not when the therapies arrive, but when they become widely anticipated. So it means that the imperative to engage in all of this forward planning, and I don't just mean us or professional futurists, I mean actual policymakers and opinion formers, to actually have a sense of proportion about what's going to happen, that imperative is that much greater because the point at which that forward planning is going to have its value is that much sooner.
Thanks for your talk, Aubrey. You just touched on a little bit of the question. We've had the question, what can an individual do? If we go to the other end of the scale, governments can put provide rails for your work or put barriers in the way. What's the best role for an enlightened legislature?
Well, I don't think there's really any such thing as enlightened legislature. The fact is, politicians, we pay politicians to make most of our decisions for us. And the reason they take the job is because they like making our decisions for us. Which means that, ultimately, politicians are about getting re-elected. And therefore, public policy ultimately almost always follows public opinion rather than leading public opinion. So this is what I mean by I don't know if I think it enlightened legislature. Maybe the occasional politician who might see some personal, electoral value in supporting an as yet unpopular visionary cause, but those situations are few and far between. And at the moment, it would be electorally counterproductive for pretty much any politician in any democracy in the world to actually go out on a platform of defeating aging, because the pro-aging stance is simply too entrenched among the electorate. So I think we have to start by turning over the public, and that will lead very rapidly to a transition in public policy. Then the question is, how do we turn the public over? The answer is, turn the opinion poll form is over. Once we've got Oprah Winfrey on board, game over. Job done. So then the question is, how do we get them on board? And of course we have to then worry about what their vested interests are, and they of course revolve around making sure that their show doesn't get canned by the TV network or whatever, which means that, again, they sort of have to follow public opinion. So it's sort of circular, but only slightly. At least opinion formers in the media tend to have some, tend to derive some value from at least looking as though they're leading public opinion rather than following it. So that's the sort of place we try to start.